Captain Thomas Reed pressed his back against the cold metal wall, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air of the Syndicate's fortress. The neural interface embedded in his wrist counted down silently, 3 minutes until the next patrol. He'd studied their patterns for weeks, watching, learning, preparing for this moment. "Command, I'm approaching the detention level," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. The comms unit in his ear crackled with static. "Copy that, Reed. Remember, this is strictly off the books. If you're caught, the Alliance will disavow any knowledge of this operation." Thomas grimaced. "Understood. Not my first dance, Commander Vega." The fortress, carved into the side of an asteroid in the Matar Belt, was the stronghold of the Drazari Syndicate, interstellar criminals who dealt in everything from weapons to sentient trafficking. Their latest acquisition, Astrid Nylane, daughter of the Luminari ambassador. Her kidnapping had thrown the fragile peace negotiations between humans and the Luminari into chaos, exactly as the Syndicate had planned. The countdown reached 0. Thomas slipped around the corner, his stealth suit absorbing the dim light of the corridor. The detention level was eerily quiet. Too quiet. He checked his scanner again, only one life sign in the entire block. Either the intel was wrong, or this was a trap. He'd bet on the latter. The cell at the end of the corridor was sealed with a biometric lock. Thomas retrieved a small device from his belt, pressing it against the panel. The screen flickered, cycling through genetic patterns until it found a match. With a soft hiss, the door slid open. Inside, a slender figure huddled in the corner. Her luminescent skin glowed a faint blue in the darkness, pulsing slightly with each breath, a characteristic of the Luminari species. Her eyes, large and silvery, reflected the dim light like mirrors when she looked up at him. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice melodic despite the fear that edged it. Thomas lowered his weapon. "Captain Thomas Reed, Alliance Special Operations. I'm here to take you home, Ambassador Nylane." "It's just Astrid," she corrected, rising gracefully to her feet. She was tall, nearly matching Thomas's 6-foot frame. "And you're either very brave or very foolish, Captain." A half-smile tugged at his lips. "Both, according to my commanding officers." "Can you walk?" She nodded, and Thomas noticed the bruises on her wrists where restraints had been. Something hot and angry flared in his chest. "We need to move. Now." He handed her a small device. "Put this on your wrist. It'll mask your biosignature from their scanners." As she fastened the device, alarms suddenly blared throughout the facility. Red emergency lights bathed the corridor outside in a bloody glow. "That's not good," Thomas muttered, checking his scanner. "They've detected an unauthorized launch from their hangar bay. Our diversion just kicked in early. What does that mean for us?" Astrid asked, her voice steadied despite the circumstances. "It means we're taking the scenic route." Thomas tapped his neural interface, pulling up the station schematics. "Maintenance shaft 32B should get us to the secondary hangar. I have a ship waiting." They moved swiftly through the corridors, ducking into alcoves whenever patrols rushed past. Astrid kept pace with Thomas, her movements fluid and silent. There was a natural grace to her that spoke of formal training, diplomatic corps, perhaps, but something more as well. As they approached the maintenance shaft, a squad of Syndicate guards appeared at the intersection ahead. Thomas pulled Astrid into a service closet, their bodies pressed close in the narrow space. He could feel the gentle warmth radiating from her skin, a few degrees hotter than human normal. The subtle, sweet scent of her reminded him of jasmine and something alien he couldn't identify. "Don't move," he whispered, his lips close to her ear. She nodded, her eyes wide but unafraid. When the patrol passed, they continued to the maintenance shaft. Thomas removed the grating and gestured for Astrid to enter first. "It's a straight shot down for 20 levels," he explained. Then we'll need to. The corridor behind them erupted in weapons fire. A plasma bolt grazed Thomas's shoulder, burning through his stealth suit and into flesh. He grunted in pain but pushed Astrid into the shaft before turning to return fire. 3 guards went down before a 4th shot caught Thomas in the leg. He fell back against the wall, his vision blurring. "Go!" he shouted to Astrid, who was watching from the shaft entrance. "The coordinates are in the device I gave you. Get to the ship." Instead of fleeing, she emerged from the shaft, her face set in determination. With surprising strength, she hoisted Thomas up and helped him into the maintenance tunnel. Then, using some hidden mechanism in her sleeve, she fired a burst of blinding light at their pursuers before sealing the shaft behind them. What the hell was that? Thomas gasped as they began their descent, his wounded leg threatening to give out with each step. "Luminary defensive technology," she replied calmly. "Did you really think a diplomat's daughter would travel without protection?" "I'm starting to think there's a lot about you I don't know," Thomas said through gritted teeth. Her silver eyes met his, and for a moment, something passed between them, understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of trust. "Likewise, Captain Reed," she said softly. "But right now, let's focus on getting out of here alive. Then we can properly introduce ourselves." They continued their descent, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter above them. Thomas's wounds throbbed, but he pushed through the pain. The mission was what mattered. Get the girl, get out, repair the diplomatic damage. Simple. Straightforward. What Thomas couldn't know, was that by rescuing Astrid Nylane, he had set in motion events that would change the course of his life forever. The escape pod hurtled through the void, its navigation system locked onto the coordinates of a small trading outpost on the edge of the Veil Nebula. Inside, Thomas fought to remain conscious as Astrid tended to his wounds with the limited medical supplies they'd found on board. "You're lucky," she said, her voice soft as she applied a regenerative gel to the plasma burn on his shoulder. "A few centimeters to the right and you'd have lost the arm." Thomas winced as the gel began its work, knitting damaged tissue back together. "Luck had nothing to do with it. I've spent years perfecting the art of not quite dying." A smile ghosted across Astrid's face, her luminescent skin pulsing slightly brighter. Thomas found himself captivated by the way light seemed to dance beneath her surface, like watching moonlight play across a calm sea. "Your physiology is fascinating," he said, immediately regretting how clinical it sounded. "As is yours," she replied, surprising him. "Your species generates so much heat. It's quite remarkable." She placed her hand on his forehead, and Thomas was startled by the coolness of her touch. It was soothing against his fevered skin. "Your temperature is elevated," she observed. "Is this normal for humans?" "Not exactly." Thomas shifted, trying to find a comfortable position with his injured leg. "It's called a fever. Part of our healing process, but not always a good sign." Concern flickered in her silver eyes. "The outpost is another 6 hours away. Will you?" "I'll be fine," he assured her, though he wasn't entirely convinced himself. "I've had worse." The pod's emergency lights cast long shadows as Astrid finished dressing his wounds. In the dim light, Thomas noticed details about her he'd missed during their frantic escape, the intricate patterns that occasionally rippled across her skin like bioluminescent tattoos, the subtle iridescence of her hair that shifted between platinum and pale blue depending on how the light struck it. "You keep staring," she said without looking up from her work. Thomas cleared his throat. "Sorry. We don't get many Luminari in Alliance space. And we don't get many humans in the Celestial Dominion," she countered. "Before the peace negotiations began, I'd only seen your kind in educational simulations." "And now?" Thomas asked. "What do you think of us now?" Astrid tilted her head, regarding him curiously. "You're more complex than the simulation suggested. More contradictory." Her fingers lightly traced the outline of an old scar on his forearm. You heal yourselves by forming permanent marks. You risk your lives for strangers. You wage wars and write poetry about peace. That about sums us up, Thomas admitted with a weak laugh that quickly turned into a grimace of pain. Astrid's expression turned serious. Rest now. Your body needs to recover. Despite his protests, exhaustion soon overcame him, and Thomas drifted into a fitful sleep. He dreamed of silver eyes and skin that glowed like starlight. The trading outpost of Helios Point was a ramshackle collection of repurposed mining structures and hastily constructed habitation units, all clustered around a central marketplace dome. It wasn't much to look at, but it was neutral territory, neither alliance nor dominion, and the locals didn't ask questions as long as you had credits to spend. Thomas limped alongside Astrid through the crowded marketplace, his arm draped over her shoulders for support. His fever had broken during their approach, but his injuries still throbbed with each heartbeat. We need somewhere to lie low, he muttered, scanning the throngs of diverse species that filled the market. Somewhere safe. Astrid nodded, her luminescence dimmed to an almost imperceptible glow, a precaution they'd agreed upon to avoid drawing attention. Even so, several patrons turned to stare as they passed. Humans were common enough, but Lumidari were a rare sight in this sector. They found lodging in a quiet corner of the outpost, a small two-room unit with basic amenities and, most importantly, no questions asked when Thomas paid in untraceable credit chips. Home sweet home, he said as the door slid closed behind them. At least for the next few days. Astrid surveyed the Spartan accommodations, a small food preparation area, a seating space with worn cushions, and 2 sleeping chambers separated by a thin partition. It will suffice, she said, helping Thomas to one of the sleeping platforms. You should rest properly now. I'll secure the perimeter. Thomas caught her wrist as she turned to leave. Thank you, he said simply. For not leaving me behind. Most people would have. Something flickered in her eyes, surprise, perhaps, or understanding. My people do not abandon those who risk themselves for others. It is not our way. Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary before she gently extracted herself from his grip and moved to check the unit's security systems. Over the next 3 days, Thomas's wounds began to heal properly thanks to the medical supplies Astrid had procured from the marketplace. They established a routine. Astrid would venture out for necessities while Thomas monitored communications, searching for any sign that their escape had been tracked. On the evening of the 4th day, as Astrid returned with supplies, she found Thomas standing by the small viewport, staring out at the nebula that filled half the visible sky with swirling purple and blue gases. It reminds me of home, she said, placing her purchases on the preparation surface. The luminous sea in the southern hemisphere of my world has similar coloration during the 3rd lunar cycle. Thomas turned to her, struck by how the nebula's light played across her features, enhancing her natural luminescence. It's beautiful, he said, and they both knew he wasn't just talking about the view. Astrid moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could feel the gentle warmth radiating from her skin. My father will be worried, she said softly. The negotiations were to last another month before I was taken. We'll get word to him soon, Thomas promised. But we need to be careful. The syndicate has eyes everywhere, and they won't be happy we escaped. Why did you come for me? Astrid asked suddenly, turning to face him fully. Your commander said the mission was unsanctioned. You risked your career, your life, for someone you've never met. Thomas considered the question carefully. The official answer is that your kidnapping threatened the peace process. The Alliance has invested too much in these negotiations to let them fail. And the unofficial answer? He met her gaze. I've seen what happens when peace talks collapse. I've buried too many friends because diplomats couldn't agree on border coordinates or resource rights. If rescuing you meant even a chance at preventing another conflict, well, it wasn't really a choice. Astrid studied him, the patterns on her skin shifting in what Thomas had come to recognize as an expression of deep thought. "Your species confuses me," she said finally. "You're capable of such violence, yet also such selflessness." "We contain multitudes," Thomas said with a small smile. Astrid stepped closer, raising a hand to his face. Thomas held perfectly still as her cool fingers traced the line of his jaw, a gesture that seemed both curious and intimate. "In my culture," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "rescuing another from peril creates a bond. A connection that transcends ordinary relationships." Thomas swallowed hard, suddenly very aware of how close they were standing. "And what does that connection entail?" "It varies," she replied, her silver eyes searching his. "But it always begins with understanding." Slowly, deliberately, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, a lumidari gesture of deep trust. Thomas felt a strange, pleasant tingling where their skin touched, like gentle electricity coursing between them. "I would understand you, Thomas Reed," she murmured, her breath cool against his lips. "If you would allow it." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Then, acting on instinct rather than thought, Thomas closed the remaining distance and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, exploratory, the meeting of two worlds. Astrid stiffened momentarily in surprise before relaxing into the contact, her hands sliding up to rest on his shoulders. Thomas felt a curious sensation spread from his lips through his entire body, a pleasant warmth unlike anything he'd experienced before. When they finally separated, both were breathing faster. Astrid's skin pulsed with a deeper blue light, the patterns swirling in what seemed to be excitement or pleasure. "Is that a human gesture of understanding?" she asked, a hint of wonder in her voice. "Something like that," Thomas replied, unable to keep a smile from his face. "We call it a kiss." "Kiss," she repeated, as if testing the word. "It's agreeable." A sudden alert from Thomas's neural interface shattered the moment. He checked the notification, his expression immediately turning serious. "Someone scanning the outpost for lumidari biosignatures," he said, moving quickly to the security console. "The syndicates found us." Astrid's glow dimmed instantly. "How long do we have?" "Not long enough." Thomas pulled up the ship's communications. "Change of plans. We need to leave, now." As they hurriedly gathered their essential belongings, Thomas caught Astrid looking at him with an unreadable expression. "What?" he asked, checking his weapon. "Nothing," she said softly. "It's just, there is much I still wish to understand about you, Thomas Reed." Despite the danger closing in around them, Thomas felt something unfamiliar bloom in his chest, hope, perhaps, or the beginning of something he hadn't dared imagine. "We'll have time," he promised. "Once we get you home safely." What neither of them realized as they prepared for their escape was that home might come to mean something entirely different for both of them before their journey's end. The stolen transport ship sliced through the asteroid field, engines straining as Thomas executed another evasive maneuver. Behind them, two Syndicate pursuit vessels adjusted their course, relentless in their chase. "They're persistent," Thomas muttered, his hands dancing across the flight controls. Astrid monitored the shield readings from the co-pilot's seat. "The Syndicate doesn't surrender valuable assets easily." "Is that what you are? An asset?" Thomas glanced at her, noticing how her luminescence flickered with what he now recognized as indignation. "To them, perhaps." Her silver eyes narrowed. "To my people, I am something far more significant." Thomas guided the ship around a massive asteroid, using it as momentary cover. "Your father's the ambassador, but there's more to it, isn't there? The way those guards reacted when you used that light weapon, they seemed afraid." Astrid hesitated, then nodded. "I am lumidari royalty, third in line to the celestial throne. My father didn't merely come to negotiate peace, he came to evaluate whether humans were worthy of alliance with our civilization. The revelation hit Thomas like a plasma bolt. So your kidnapping wasn't just about disrupting peace talks. No, Astrid confirmed. It was an attempt to provoke war. The abduction of Lumidari royalty is considered an act of aggression against our entire species. A proximity alert blared as one of the pursuit ships closed in. Thomas rolled their vessel, barely avoiding a barrage of weapons fire. Hold on, he shouted, directing their ship toward a narrow gap between two colliding asteroids. They squeezed through seconds before the space closed, crushing one of their pursuers. The second Syndicate vessel veered away, temporarily breaking off pursuit. In the moment of calm that followed, Thomas engaged the autopilot and turned to Astrid. Why keep this from me? Would it have changed your decision to rescue me? She asked. No, but... Then it wasn't relevant to the mission. Her expression softened. But it is relevant now, because my return has greater implications than you realize. Before Thomas could respond, his neural interface pinged with an encrypted message. He opened it, his face darkening as he read. What is it? Astrid asked. Intelligence from Commander Vega. The Syndicate wasn't working alone. Thomas met her gaze. They had help from within the Alliance military, high-ranking officers who believe humans should stand alone in the galaxy. Astrid's skin pulsed with alarm. Then my rescue. Makes us both targets, Thomas finished. The conspirators will try to eliminate us before we can expose them. And before I can return to complete the alliance, Astrid added. She reached across the space between them, taking his hand. Her touch sent that now familiar pleasant tingling through his skin. Thomas, there's something else you should know. About us, about the kiss we shared. Her luminescence intensified, patterns swirling across her skin in what seemed like nervousness. In my culture, the sharing of breath, what you call a kiss, with someone outside our species is significant. It forms a bond that is recognized by Lumidari law. Thomas stared at her. What kind of bond? One that cannot be broken. Her eyes held his, unwavering. In the eyes of my people, we are now joined. Forever. The implications staggered him. You mean we're what humans might call married, yes. Though the concept goes deeper for Lumidari. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, processing this revelation. And you didn't think to mention this before I kissed you? I didn't expect you to initiate a joining ritual, she countered. Besides, it's only binding if I choose to register it upon my return. And will you? Thomas asked, suddenly aware of how important her answer felt. Before she could respond, the ship's warning system blared. 3 Alliance military vessels had appeared on long-range scanners, converging on their position. Your conspirators have found us, Astrid observed grimly. Thomas returned to the controls, plotting a new course. Then we avoid Alliance space entirely. We'll take you directly to your people. The journey will be dangerous, she warned. The path to Lumidari space crosses territories controlled by species hostile to both our kinds. Thomas flashed her a determined smile. Dangerous seems to be our specialty. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. We'll figure out this bond thing once you're safe. As they accelerated away from their pursuers, Thomas couldn't help wondering what awaited them in Lumidari space, and what it would mean for his future. One thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same. The Crimson Expanse lived up to its name, a vast region of space where the stellar dust cast everything in a blood-red hue. It was the fastest route to Lumidari space, but also one of the most treacherous, home to raiders and outlaws from a dozen different species. Thomas and Astrid had been traveling through it for 3 days, taking shifts at the controls while the other rested. They hadn't spoken much about the revelation of their marriage since fleeing the Alliance ships, both tacitly agreeing to focus on survival first. Proximity alert, Astrid called from the pilot's seat as Thomas emerged from the sleeping quarters. Vessel approaching from the starboard quadrant. Thomas quickly slid into the co-pilot's chair, scanning the readouts. Krell Raider. Heavily armed. He glanced at Astrid. Ready for some excitement? A smile tugged at her lips. With you? Always. The Krell ship fired a warning shot across their bow, the universal signal to prepare for boarding. Instead of slowing, Thomas took the controls and executed a tight spiral maneuver, bringing their weapons to bear. You still remember how to use that light weapon of yours? He asked as they dove beneath the Raider's firing arc. Of course. Astrid's fingers danced across the defense panel. Though I prefer to call it a solar lance. Their smaller ship had the advantage of speed and maneuverability. After a brief but intense exchange of fire, the damaged Raider broke off pursuit, limping away toward a nearby asteroid belt. Not bad for a princess and a captain, Thomas grinned, the adrenaline of combat still coursing through him. Astrid's luminescence brightened with excitement. We make an effective team. Their eyes met, and the tension that had been building between them these past days seemed to crystallize in the moment. Without a word, Thomas leaned across the space between their seats and kissed her. Unlike their first tentative kiss, this one was electric from the start, hungry and passionate. Astrid responded with equal fervor, her cool lips warming against his. The luminescent patterns on her skin swirled rapidly, spreading from her face down her neck and across what exposed skin he could see, glowing brighter with each passing second. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. The cockpit was bathed in the bright blue light emanating from Astrid's skin. That was. She whispered. Yeah, Thomas agreed, equally at a loss for words. Astrid touched her fingers to her lips, looking slightly dazed. Among my people, such intensity is rare. We are taught to maintain control of our luminescence. I like it when you lose control, Thomas said softly, brushing a strand of her iridescent hair behind her ear. She caught his hand, pressing it to her cheek. Thomas, when we reach my homeworld, things will become complicated. My status, our bond, they will raise questions among my people. What kind of questions? Whether a human can fulfill the responsibilities of being joined to Lumidari royalty. Her silver eyes held his, serious now. There will be tests. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Tests? Like exams? A small smile flickered across her face. More like trials. Challenges to prove your worthiness. It is tradition when an outsider joins with one of the royal line. And if I fail? Her expression grew solemn. Then our bond would be severed, and you would be returned to your people, with certain memories removed. Thomas stared at her. They would take my memories of you. It is considered merciful, she explained, though she didn't sound convinced. To remember a severed bond is thought to be too painful. Before Thomas could respond, the ship's navigation system chimed. They had reached the boundary of Lumidari space. Ahead of them, a massive nebula shimmered with bioluminescent gases, blues and purples swirling in patterns remarkably similar to those on Astrid's skin. The celestial veil, she said, her voice filled with emotion. The outer boundary of my homeland. As they approached, a squadron of sleek ships emerged from the nebula, Lumidari vessels, their hulls seemingly alive with the same glowing patterns as Astrid's skin. Unidentified vessel, you have entered sovereign Lumidari space, came a melodic voice over their communication system. State your purpose. Astrid leaned forward. This is Princess Astrid Nylane, daughter of Ambassador Corlin, third heir to the celestial throne. I am returning from captivity with the assistance of Captain Thomas Reed of Earth. A moment of silence followed, then, verification confirmed, Your Highness. Escort is being dispatched. Welcome home. As the Lumidari ships surrounded them, Astrid turned to Thomas, her expression a mixture of joy and apprehension. Whatever happens next, she said, taking his hand in hers, know that I choose this bond. I choose you. Thomas swallowed the knot of emotion in his throat. I'm not great at tests, but for you, I'll pass whatever trials they throw at me. She smiled then, her luminescence pulsing with an emotion Thomas was beginning to recognize as love. Then let us face them together. Hand in hand, they watched as the escort guided their ship toward the nebula, toward Astrid's home, and toward whatever future awaited them among the stars. The Lumidari capital city of Nyxeris was unlike anything Thomas had ever seen. Structures of crystalline material rose in graceful spirals, each building seeming to grow organically from the ground rather than being constructed. Everywhere, the same bioluminescent patterns he'd come to associate with Astrid's people pulsed through the architecture, creating a city that felt alive. For 7 days, Thomas had been kept separate from Astrid, housed in luxurious quarters, but essentially isolated except for servants and officials who came to prepare him for the trials of union. Tonight would mark the final test, after which his fate among the Lumidari would be decided. The ceremonial attire suits you, remarked Ambassador Corlin, Astrid's father, as he entered Thomas's chambers. Like his daughter, he had luminescent skin, though his patterns were more rigid and formal, befitting his station. Thomas adjusted the flowing silver garment that had been provided for him. Thank you, Ambassador. I'm still getting used to it. You have performed admirably in the trials thus far, Corlin said, his tone measured. The test of physical endurance, the challenge of intellect, even the ritual of spiritual communion, few outsiders have progressed so far. I had good motivation, Thomas replied simply. Corlin studied him with those characteristic silver eyes. Yes. Your feelings for my daughter are evident. As are hers for you. He moved to the viewport overlooking the city. What you may not understand is what tonight's final trial truly means. Thomas joined him at the window. Astrid mentioned something about a choice. Indeed. The trial of sovereign will. Corlin turned to face him directly. Captain Reed, when you rescued my daughter, you unknowingly initiated an ancient ritual among our people. The act of saving a royal Lumidari life creates a debt that can only be repaid through lifelong service or union. I didn't do it for a reward, Thomas said. Which is precisely why you've come this far. Corlin's luminescence pulsed with what seemed to be approval. Tonight, before the royal assembly, you will be offered a choice: return to your people with our gratitude and substantial compensation, or remain with us, with Astrid, and become Lumidari. Thomas blinked in surprise. Become Lumidari? Is that even possible? Through a process we call celestial transformation, yes. It is rare, offered only to those who have proven themselves worthy of joining our society. Corlin gestured to Thomas's body. Your physical form would change. You would gain our abilities, our lifespan, which is considerably longer than human standard, and your bond with Astrid would be formalized under our law. The implications were staggering. Thomas stared out at the alien city, trying to process what he was being told. There is one more thing you should understand, Corlin continued. If you choose transformation, your connection to Earth would be severed. The Alliance would be informed that you perished during my daughter's rescue. I'd never see my home again, Thomas said quietly. You would have a new home, Corlin replied. And the knowledge that your sacrifice cemented the peace between our peoples. The conspiracy you uncovered has been exposed, thanks to the information you provided. The Alliance has purged those elements that sought war. A gentle chime sounded throughout the chamber. It is time, Corlin said. The assembly awaits. The Royal Assembly Chamber was a vast amphitheater carved from a single massive crystal. Hundreds of Lumidari dignitaries filled the tiered seating, their combined luminescence creating a spectacular light show as patterns rippled through the crowd. Thomas stood in the center of the chamber, acutely aware of all eyes upon him. At the far end, seated on 3 crystalline thrones, were the rulers of the Lumidari, the celestial sovereign and her two heirs. Astrid stood to one side, dressed in formal regalia that emphasized her royal status. Their eyes met across the chamber, and even at a distance, Thomas could see the emotion in her gaze. Whatever happened next would determine both their futures. The sovereign rose, her luminescence commanding immediate silence from the assembly. Captain Thomas Reed of Earth, her melodic voice echoed throughout the chamber. You stand before us having completed all but the final trial. You have demonstrated strength, wisdom, and compassion, qualities we value in the Luminari. She descended from her throne, approaching Thomas with graceful movements. Your actions in rescuing Princess Astrid have earned you the right of choice. She gestured, and two attendants came forward. One carried a small chest, the other a crystalline orb that pulsed with energy. Before you are two paths. The sovereign indicated the chest. This contains wealth beyond imagining by human standards, and our eternal gratitude. Choose this, and you will return to your people a hero, though with no memory of your time among us or your bond with Princess Astrid. She then gestured to the orb. This is the essence of transformation. Choose this, and you will become one with the Luminari, able to remain with Princess Astrid as her consort, but never again to walk among your own kind. A hush fell over the assembly as the sovereign stepped back. The choice is yours, Captain Reed. Choose wisely. Thomas looked at the two options before him, then raised his eyes to find Astrid. Though her face remained composed, her luminescence betrayed her emotions, hope and fear intermingled in the swirling patterns of light. In that moment, memories flashed through Thomas's mind, the feel of Astrid's cool skin against his, the way her luminescence brightened when they kissed, the quiet conversations they'd shared about their vastly different worlds. He thought of Earth, of the life he'd built there, of Commander Vega and his fellow officers. He thought of a future without Astrid, without the connection they'd forged. Thomas stepped forward, his decision made. He reached for the crystalline orb, its energy humming beneath his fingertips. I choose transformation, he said, his voice steady. I choose Astrid. A murmur rippled through the assembly. Astrid's luminescence flared brilliantly, her joy unmistakable even as she maintained her royal composure. The sovereign nodded, seeming pleased. So be it. The transformation will begin at dawn. Tonight, you will have time to prepare. As the assembly concluded, Astrid was finally permitted to approach him. When they were close enough for private conversation, her composure broke, and she took his hands in hers. You understand what you're giving up? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Thomas nodded. I do. But I understand what I'm gaining, too. He squeezed her hands gently. You once told me that rescuing someone creates a bond. I think that bond was there from the moment I saw you in that cell. Astrid's luminescence pulsed with emotion as she leaned forward to kiss him, oblivious to the watching assembly. This kiss was different from their others, a promise, a beginning. When they parted, Thomas smiled. So, what exactly does becoming Luminari entail? Will I glow in the dark? Astrid laughed, the sound like crystal chimes. That and more. But don't worry, I'll be with you through every moment. As they left the chamber hand in hand, Thomas realized that what had begun as a rescue mission had become something far more profound, a journey that had led him across the stars to find not just Astrid, but a new purpose, a new life. And as the twin moons of the Luminari homeworld rose over the crystalline spires of Nyxeris, Captain Thomas Reed prepared to say goodbye to his human existence and embrace the unknown future that awaited him among the stars, with the woman he loved by his side. The universe, it seemed, had greater plans for him than he could have ever imagined.